He stripped the necklace from his wife's neck in front of every criminal king in America and clasped it around his mistress instead. Not in private, not behind closed doors. In the middle of the Black Summit, the one night each year when every Don, every capo, every underworld queen gathered under one roof to reaffirm the code they lived and died by. Vivian Ashcroft Viscari stood 3 feet away and watched it happen. She didn't scream. She didn't reach for the necklace. She didn't beg. She removed her wedding ring, slowly, deliberately, set it on the white linen tablecloth beside her untouched wine glass, and walked out of the room without looking back. Ask yourself, if every person you'd ever built, protected, and sacrificed for watched someone take everything from you in a single gesture, what would you do? If this story already has you gripping your seat, you're exactly where you're supposed to be. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss what comes next. Stories that hit like a freight train and don't let go. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me the city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to the night it all began to fall apart. The Black Summit had been held at the Castel Verde estate for 31 consecutive years. The estate sat on 40 acres of manicured property outside the city, surrounded by iron gates and men with earpieces who hadn't smiled since the Clinton administration. The ballroom inside could seat 400. Tonight it held 212, which meant every person present had been vetted, vouched for, and considered essential. Vivian had attended every single one of those 31 summits. She remembered the first one. She'd been 26, still learning the names, still trying to memorize which Don preferred to be addressed by title and which ones considered it a sign of weakness. Damien had squeezed her hand under the table that night and said, "Watch everyone. Say nothing. Remember everything." She'd done exactly that. And then she'd kept doing it, year after year, long after Damien had stopped squeezing her hand. This year she wore a charcoal silk dress that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Her hair was pinned back the way she'd worn it since she was 30. Clean, severe, nothing to grab. She carried no bag. She didn't need one. Everything she needed at events like this lived in her head. The Donna necklace was already around her throat when she arrived. It was always around her throat at the summit. That was the point. The necklace wasn't jewelry. It was language. It told every person in that room exactly where the authority of the Viscari syndicate resided, and it said it without a single word being spoken. The piece itself wasn't flashy. Most people who didn't know its history would have glanced at it and moved on. A platinum chain, heavy but not ostentatious. At the center, a dark oval stone, not a gem anyone could name, flanked by 2 smaller diamonds in an antique setting. It had been commissioned in 1887 by a Calabrian matriarch who'd held together a criminal empire through 2 wars, 3 assassination attempts, and a famine. She'd passed it to the woman her son married. That woman passed it to the next. The line had transferred it 15 times across 130 years. It had never once been given to a mistress. That was not a technicality. That was the entire point. Vivian stood near the east wing of the ballroom, a position she'd chosen deliberately, angled so she could see both the main entrance and the corridor that led to the private dining rooms. She was speaking with Conti, the aging capo from the Chicago corridor, about a shipping dispute that had been quietly festering for 3 months. Conti had bad knees and a good memory, and he appreciated that Vivian never made him stand for long conversations. They'd moved to a position near the wall where he could lean slightly without it being obvious. "The Marchetti crew is overstepping," Conti said. His voice was low, unhurried. "They know the agreement. The northern route was settled in 2009. My people don't make unauthorized moves. Theirs do." "I know," Vivian said, "and Marchetti knows that I know. He's testing whether anyone will say something before the quarter closes." "Will someone?" "Someone already has." She let that sit for a moment. "The routing will be corrected by Friday. You won't need to escalate." Conti studied her for a moment. His eyes were the pale, tired blue of a man who had seen too many things he couldn't discuss at dinner. He gave a small nod. Not gratitude exactly, more like recognition. That was how most of Vivian's conversations ended. Not with applause, with the quiet acknowledgement that something had been handled. She'd been doing this for 22 years, building the invisible architecture that kept the syndicate from tearing itself apart between the big meetings and the formal agreements. When two families were 3 weeks from open conflict, it was usually Vivian who found the third option neither of them had considered. When a political contact needed to be cultivated quietly, not approached officially, not with Damien's name anywhere near it, it was Vivian who made the introduction. When someone's son ended up on the wrong side of a debt, and the situation needed to disappear before it became a war, Vivian was the one who made it disappear. Damien knew this. He had at one point understood exactly what she was worth. At some point he had stopped calculating that way. She didn't know precisely when it had changed. Maybe there wasn't a single moment. Maybe it was the accumulation of years in which he'd stopped asking her what she thought and started assuming she'd handle whatever needed handling without needing to be asked. Maybe it was Celine, who had arrived in Damien's orbit 4 years ago as a facilitator for a Paris-based banking contact and had never fully left. Vivienne wasn't naive. She had known about Celine for most of those 4 years. She had made choices about what to do with that knowledge. Or rather, she had made the choice not to escalate it. Not yet, because the syndicate was in the middle of a restructuring and instability at the top would cost lives. Her choice. She had weighed it and made it with both eyes open. What she had not calculated, what she had not let herself fully imagine, was that Damien would do something this public. She heard the shift in the room before she saw it. It was subtle, the way 212 people in a single space could change the texture of a room just by turning their attention in one direction. Vivian looked toward the center of the ballroom. Damien stood at the head of the long banquet table. He was 53, still physically imposing, broad across the shoulders, a face that had never been conventionally handsome, but had always commanded attention. He was wearing the charcoal suit he reserved for the summit, the one with the slight sheen that caught the chandelier light. Celine stood beside him. Celine Moreau was 38. She was the kind of beautiful that rooms noticed, luminous, well-dressed, with the particular confidence of a woman who had learned very early that her appearance was a resource and had been investing it strategically ever since. She wasn't stupid. Vivian had never made the mistake of thinking she was stupid. What Vivian had underestimated was how far Celine was willing to push. Damien reached up. Vivian understood what was happening before his hand made contact with the necklace. She understood it in the half-second between his hand rising and his fingers closing around the platinum chain, because she had known him for 27 years, and she knew what the set of his jaw meant when he had already decided something and was past the point of being talked out of it. She stood completely still. She felt the weight of the necklace leave her throat. She heard the clasp, quiet, final. She watched Damien step back, and she watched Celine raise her chin slightly as the necklace settled against her collarbone, and she watched 212 people go very, very quiet. The silence in that room was not the silence of shock. These were not people who shocked easily. It was the silence of people recalibrating, people who understood exactly what they had just witnessed and were already, in the private machinery of their minds, adjusting their understanding of what the next 12 months would look like. Vivian reached down. Her wedding ring was a platinum band, plain, without stones. She had chosen it herself 22 years ago because she'd said she didn't want something she could catch on things. She'd worn it every day since. She slid it off her left hand. She was aware of her own steadiness, the absence of trembling, as something she had to consciously maintain the way you maintain posture under weight. She set the ring on the white tablecloth beside her wine glass. She walked out. She did not look at Damien. She did not look at Celine. She did not look at any of the 212 people who watched her cross the ballroom floor and push through the side door and disappear. She got as far as the hallway, the long corridor with the marble floor and the portraits of men she'd never met, before she stopped walking. She stood with her back against the wall and pressed both palms flat against the cool stone and breathed. Her chest hurt in a way that wasn't physical. Or maybe it was physical. She couldn't tell. She stood there for a long moment, 30 seconds, maybe a minute, and let the thing she was feeling move through her without trying to name it, or redirect it, or use it. Then she pushed off the wall, straightened her dress, and kept walking. Outside, the night air was cold enough to be clarifying. She walked to the car without calling her driver first. He'd been watching the building, and he was already moving by the time she reached the bottom of the steps. Good man, 20 years. He had the particular gift of understanding when questions were not welcome. In the car, she didn't speak. She watched the estate gates close behind them through the rear window. Back in the ballroom, she knew, the machinery of the criminal world was already grinding through its recalculations. Deals that had been on the verge of closing would be paused. Calls would be made. Men who had committed to certain arrangements under the assumption of certain power structures would be spending the next 48 hours quietly reassessing. Damien would not understand this yet. He would understand that he'd made a statement. He would believe the statement had been received. He was not wrong about that last part. He was catastrophically wrong about what the reception meant. Vivian did not spend the drive home planning. She had learned long ago that the best thinking didn't happen in cars. It happened in silence, after sleep, when the noise of events had settled into pattern. Tonight she would not sleep particularly well, but she would lie still, and the patterns would begin to form, and by morning she would have the outline of what came next. The necklace was not the thing that could be taken from her. He had forgotten that. He had, in some fundamental way, confused the symbol with the substance it represented. That was his mistake. Not the affair, not the insult. Those were personal failures, and Vivian had, over 22 years, developed a professional relationship with personal failures. You survived them. You metabolized them. You kept working. The mistake was strategic. The mistake was doing it publicly, in front of every family, in the one room where the entire weight of tradition and loyalty was concentrated, and believing that a gesture could transfer what had taken her 2 decades to build. She looked out the car window at the city moving past, the light smearing in the rain that had started without her noticing. In the morning, she would begin making calls, not angry calls, not retaliatory calls. The other kind, the quiet ones, the ones she'd been making for 22 years, the ones that had no official record and left no paper trail and moved the world anyway. She'd built something Damien didn't fully understand even now, not power through fear, something older than that, something that fear could break in a day but that trust had to spend years constructing. He would discover, soon enough, what he had actually dismantled when he reached up and unclasped that necklace. Vivian pressed her fingers against the place on her throat where the weight had rested for 31 years. It felt strange. Not wrong, exactly. Just absent. She folded her hands in her lap and watched the city lights go by and let the car carry her home through the rain. And she did not cry, because she had work to do, and crying, whatever it was worth, was going to have to wait. The house was empty when she arrived. Not truly empty. There were staff. There was always staff. A skeleton crew that kept the Viscari residence running regardless of the hour. But the particular quality of emptiness she meant was the kind that came from a house that had stopped being a home some years back without anyone formally announcing it. The kind you felt in the way sound traveled differently through rooms that had too much furniture and not enough living. She thanked the driver. She went inside. The kitchen light was on. Someone had left a plate covered in foil on the counter. Habit, not foresight. She didn't touch it. She poured 2 inches of bourbon into a glass that had been a wedding gift from a Sicilian Don who was now dead, and she carried it to the room she used as an office on the 2nd floor, and she sat down behind her desk without turning on the overhead light. The desk lamp was enough. She sat with the bourbon untouched in front of her and looked at the surface of the desk. It was organized the way she organized everything. By function, by frequency of use, nothing decorative except one small framed photograph in the upper left corner. The photograph was 12 years old. It showed Vivian and a woman named Cora Falcone at what appeared to be a garden party, both of them slightly blurred from movement, both mid-laugh at something that had already passed out of frame. Cora had died 4 years later. Ovarian cancer, not violence. One of the few mercies the world occasionally granted to women in their line of work. Vivian looked at the photograph for a moment. Then she opened the bottom drawer and took out a plain leather notebook, the kind you could buy in any stationery shop. And she opened it to the first blank page and uncapped a pen and began to write. Not plans, not yet. Names. She wrote the names of every family represented at the summit tonight. Beside each name, she wrote a single word or short phrase, not a description, more like a temperature reading, where they stood, what they owed, what they feared, what they wanted that they hadn't yet asked for directly. It took her 40 minutes to fill 4 pages. When she finished, she closed the notebook and finally picked up the bourbon and took a slow sip and looked at what she'd written without reading it. Just the shape of it, the density of it, 4 pages of relationships she had personally cultivated over 2 decades of work that Damien had never fully cataloged because he had never needed to. She'd been the one who needed to. She'd been the one doing it. She was aware of something moving beneath the numbness that had carried her through the last 2 hours. Not rage. She recognized rage. It was fast and hot and clarifying in short bursts. And this wasn't that. This was slower, heavier. The specific weight of realizing that something you had given your life to building had been treated by the person who benefited from it most as furniture, background, infrastructure you didn't think about until it stopped working. She finished the bourbon. She did not pour another. She closed the notebook, put it back in the drawer, turned off the desk lamp, and went to bed. But she slept 3 hours. Not well, but enough. At 6 in the morning, she was showered and dressed and seated at the kitchen table with coffee and her phone. Outside the window, the city was still gray, still wet from the previous night's rain, the kind of early morning that felt like the world hadn't fully committed to the day yet. Her phone showed 14 missed messages. She didn't read them in order. She scanned the senders first. 3 were from Damien. She set those aside. The remaining 11 were from people she had worked with, negotiated with, or quietly protected over the years. Capos, intermediaries, the personal assistant of an elderly Don in Miami who communicated exclusively through proxies. Not one of them was asking what had happened. They all knew what had happened. They were, in their various careful ways, asking what she intended to do about it. She answered none of them immediately. Instead, she called a woman named Petra. Petra Vasily was 61 years old and nominally retired from active syndicate business. In practice, she ran an import consultancy in the financial district that everyone understood was a second layer of operations for the Eastern European corridor. She was also the only person in Vivian's life who had been both a professional ally and something close to a genuine friend for the better part of 15 years. She answered on the second ring. "I was wondering when you'd call," Petra said. Her accent was light. She'd been in America since her 20s, but it hardened slightly when she was being careful, which she was now. "Did you stay for the rest of the summit?" Vivian asked. "About 20 minutes of it." A pause. "Then Caruso and I left together. He had some things to say, I imagine." "Vivian?" Petra's voice dropped slightly, the way it did when she was about to say something that she'd been rehearsing. "What he did last night, there's no version of that where he comes out ahead. The room understood that immediately. Every person who matters understood it. I know. So I'm asking, not as strategy, just as your friend asking, how are you?" The question landed differently than Vivian expected. She sat with it for a moment. Outside the window, a pigeon landed on the fire escape railing and regarded the glass with the flat professional disinterest of a bird that had long ago concluded that humans were unpredictable and should be monitored accordingly. "I'm functional," Vivian said. "That's not an answer." "No," Vivian agreed, "it isn't." She looked at the pigeon. "I'll let you know when I have a better one." Petra accepted this. It was one of the things Vivian valued about her, so she knew when to push and when to wait, and she almost always chose correctly. "The Castellano family reached out to my office at 5 this morning," Petra said, shifting. "Not officially, through the restaurant." The restaurant was a coded reference to a middleman operation in Brooklyn. When something came through the restaurant, it meant it was being kept completely off the formal channels. "What did they want?" Vivian asked. "To know if you were available for a conversation. Their word, conversation. Not a meeting, not a negotiation, a conversation." Vivian understood the distinction. A meeting implied parties with positions to defend. A conversation meant they were coming to listen. "Tell them Thursday," she said. "The usual location." "Done." A brief pause. "There will be others." "I know." "Damien is going to realize what's happening within the week." "Probably sooner," Vivian said. "He's not stupid. He made a decision based on an incorrect understanding of where the weight actually sat." She paused. He'll figure it out. And then he'll make it worse, because that's what people do when they've made an error they can't publicly admit. What does worse look like? Vivian considered. He'll try to force acknowledgement, push Celine into official meetings, demand that the families recognize her position through formal channels. She turned her coffee cup slightly in her hands, which will accelerate everything. In your favor. I'm not... She stopped, started again. I'm not approaching this as a campaign, Petra. I'm not running against him. I'm not building toward a confrontation. Then what are you doing? I'm going back to work, Vivian said simply. What I've always done. The same calls, the same relationships, the same problems that need someone to sit across from them and find the third option. She set her coffee cup down. The difference is that now I'm doing it without the ring on my finger and without any obligation to route everything through his office first. There was a silence on the line. That's either very calm or very dangerous, Petra said finally. Probably both, Vivian said. I'll see you Thursday. She ended the call. She sat for another moment in the gray morning kitchen, and then she picked up her phone again and began returning messages. Not Damien's, not yet, but the 11 others. Each response was brief, measured. She used no language that could be characterized as oppositional or aggressive. She simply confirmed she was available, that she was working, that certain matters they'd previously discussed were still being managed. She was, in the plainest possible sense, continuing to exist. That was enough. For now, that was more than enough. By midweek, the first visible effects had begun. A shipping agreement between the Ricci corridor and the Gulf operators, which had been 3 days from final sign-off, quietly stalled. The Ricci representative called to postpone the closing meeting due to scheduling conflicts. The Gulf operators didn't protest. Both parties knew the real reason. The agreement had been brokered through Vivian's network. Without her standing to guarantee the informal understandings that held the formal agreement together, neither side was comfortable committing. A political contact in the state legislature, a man who had been, for 7 years, one of the syndicate's most reliable points of access for certain regulatory conversations, became difficult to reach. His office returned calls slowly. His assistant cited scheduling. The assistant was, it happened, the niece of a woman Vivian had helped quietly relocate and resettle after a bad situation 6 years ago. The slowness of the returned calls was not accidental. Damien noticed. Vivian knew he'd noticed because on Wednesday morning, his third message, the one she still hadn't answered, was replaced by a phone call. She let it go to voicemail. The voicemail was 40 seconds long and contained the following information. He wanted to talk. He thought they should talk. He was willing to talk somewhere private, away from the house. His voice was controlled, but there was something beneath the control that she recognized. Not guilt. Damien rarely trafficked in guilt. But the particular register of a man who had discovered that a decision he'd felt certain about had produced consequences he hadn't modeled. She didn't call back, not out of cruelty, out of timing. There was nothing to be gained from a conversation with him while he was still in the early phase of understanding what had actually happened. He would spend this phase trying to minimize it, reframe it, find the explanation that made the consequences manageable without requiring him to fully acknowledge the error. That was a phase he needed to move through on his own. She had no interest in helping him skip it. She had her own work to do. Thursday came. The conversation with the Castellano representative, a careful, well-dressed man in his late 50s named Aurelio, who had the good sense to arrive alone and the better sense to say less than he could have, lasted 90 minutes in the back room of a restaurant that served excellent pasta and had been, for 30 years, one of the more reliable neutral venues in the city. Aurelio didn't ask what she was planning. He talked about the family's concerns, the restructuring of the northern trade routes, a succession question that had been unsettled for 2 years, a request for help navigating a complication with their legal infrastructure in 2 eastern states. He talked about these things the way people talked to Vivian when they were really saying something else, not looking at what they were saying directly, but making it clear through the specificity and seriousness of the problems they laid before her that they considered her the appropriate person to bring serious problems to. She listened. She asked questions. She took no notes. She never did. And she committed to nothing formal. When the meeting ended and Aurelio stood to leave, he paused with his hand on the back of his chair. The families have long memories, he said. It was not a political statement. It was offered simply, plainly, as a fact. I know, Vivian said. He nodded once and left. She sat alone for a few minutes after he'd gone with the remains of the coffee in front of her. The restaurant was quiet at this hour, past the lunch rush, too early for dinner, the sound of someone doing dishes in the kitchen, a radio somewhere playing something low. Long memories, she thought. Yes, that was exactly the point. The Donna necklace was older than any person currently living who might claim authority over it. The women who had worn it before her had built something over generations that did not dissolve because one man had a bad night and an inflated sense of what symbols could accomplish when stripped from their context. She was not those women. But she was the woman who had spent 22 years learning from what they'd left behind, and she understood, more clearly now than she ever had, that what she'd built was not dependent on Damien's acknowledgement of it. It never had been. She'd simply been too embedded in the architecture of their marriage to see that clearly until he'd done her the favor of removing her from it. She picked up her coffee. It had gone cold. She drank it anyway. Outside on the street, the city moved through its afternoon in the ordinary way. Traffic and footsteps, and the particular indifference of a city that had seen too much to be impressed by any single story, no matter how dramatic it looked from the inside. Vivian set the cup down, straightened her jacket, and went back to work. The second week after the summit, a shipment of pharmaceutical precursors moving through the Viscari-controlled port corridor sat unclaimed on a dock in Baltimore for 72 hours. This had never happened before. The dock supervisor, a third-generation syndicate employee who had managed that terminal for 11 years without a single unexplained delay, made 4 calls in 6 hours. 2 to the Viscari logistics office, 1 to the capo responsible for the Baltimore operation, 1 to a number he kept in a separate phone that he was only supposed to use in emergencies. Nobody gave him a clear answer. On the 4th day, the shipment was quietly rerouted by parties he couldn't identify through channels that shouldn't have had access to the manifest. It arrived at its destination 2 states over, intact, with a different crest on the paperwork, not the Viscari crest. Damien received the report on a Thursday morning in his office on the 43rd floor of the Harwick building, a tower he owned through 4 layers of holding companies and used for the kind of business that required a view and a soundproofed conference room. He read the report twice. Then he set it face down on his desk and called his head of operations, a man named Grasso, and told him to be in the office in 20 minutes. Grasso arrived in 18. He was a compact, practical man who had been with Damien for 16 years and had the specific quality of someone who had long ago stopped being surprised by bad news and simply processed it as material. The Baltimore situation, Damien said, without preamble. I'm looking into it. You've been looking into it for 4 days. Grasso sat down across from the desk without being invited. That, in itself, was information. Grasso only sat when he had something he needed to say carefully. The reroute came from the Falcone corridor. That's what the manifest trail suggests. But the Falcones didn't act unilaterally. Someone cleared it. Someone with enough standing that the dock supervisor didn't push back. Damien was quiet for a moment. Who? I don't have a name yet. That's not what I asked. Grasso looked at him directly. He had a way of doing that. Flat, steady, the gaze of a man delivering a bill. The authorization pattern doesn't match anyone in our current chain of command. The silence in the room changed texture. Say it plainly, Damien said. It matches how things used to move when Mrs. Viscari was coordinating directly. Damien stood up. He walked to the window and looked out at the city and didn't say anything for long enough that Grasso shifted slightly in his chair. She's not in the chain of command, Damien said finally. No, Grasso agreed. She isn't. So what you're telling me is that someone rerouted a Viscari shipment using an authorization pattern belonging to my wife, who no longer has any official standing, and nobody stopped it because nobody questioned it. Yes. Damien turned from the window. His face was controlled, but there was something working behind his eyes. Not anger exactly, something more focused than anger. Get me the names of every dock supervisor, every logistics contact, and every corridor capo who touched that shipment. I want to know who deferred to her and why. And when I have that, then we'll have a conversation about what loyalty actually means." Grasso left. Damien stood alone in his office for a while after the door closed. He was not a man who spent much time in self-examination. It had always seemed to him like a luxury that people with too much safety could afford. But he was a strategist, and strategy required honest assessment of the board. The board currently looked like this. He had made a public declaration at the summit. He had transferred the necklace. He had expected the families to process the declaration and adjust. Instead, for the past 11 days, the families had been adjusting, just not in the direction he'd intended. He picked up his phone and called Celine. She answered on the first ring, the way she always did when she was trying to communicate something through the speed of her availability. "I need you in the office," he said. "I'm already downtown. Give me 20 minutes." She arrived in 17, which was Celine's version of a message. "I move faster than you expect me to." She was dressed for business in a way that was also dressed for impact. A structured jacket the color of deep wine, her dark hair down. The necklace was at her throat. Damien noticed it. He noticed it every time, and he was beginning to understand that the noticing had a different quality than it had 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks ago, he had looked at the necklace and felt the particular satisfaction of a man who had made a decision and followed through on it. Now he looked at it and felt something harder to name. "Sit down," he said. She sat, crossed her legs, and looked at him with the expression she used when she was being professionally attentive. It had taken him a while to learn to tell the difference between her genuine attention and her performed attention. He was not always certain, even now, which one he was getting. "The Baltimore shipment," he said. Something moved across her face, quick, barely perceptible. "I heard about that." "From who?" "From Renault. He has contacts in the Gulf Corridor." Renault was a financial facilitator who operated between Paris and New York and had been the original connection through which Celine had entered Damien's orbit 4 years ago. Damien had always found him useful and slightly irritating in equal measure. "What did Renault tell you?" "That the reroute went through the Falcone people. That it was clean. No damage to the product. No exposure, so..." She paused. "That it didn't look like a hostile move." "It wasn't hostile, Damien said. "That's what makes it worse." Celine looked at him steadily. "You think it was her?" "I think the methodology matches hers. I think the dock supervisor has been in contact with her office. I think there are people in this organization who are operating on the assumption that their primary obligation runs to my wife rather than to me." He stopped. "Former wife." Something in Celine's posture shifted. Subtle, but he caught it. The word hadn't landed the way she'd wanted it to. "She's not your former wife," Celine said carefully. "You haven't filed anything. It's a detail." "It's not a detail, Damien. It's the entire..." She stopped herself. She looked at the window, then back at him. "What are you going to do about Baltimore?" "I'm going to make it clear that the Viscari chain of command runs through this office. Through me. Through the people I designate." He looked at her directly. "Through you." "They won't accept that," she said. The words came out flat, matter-of-fact, stripped of the usual careful softening. He looked at her. She continued. "The families. They're not going to accept me in a formal coordination role. Not yet. Maybe not. I'm not asking them to accept it. I'm telling them." The room was quiet. Celine looked at him for a long moment with an expression he couldn't fully read, and then she nodded once, and the moment passed, and they moved on to logistics. But the word she'd swallowed, the one that had come after not yet, maybe not, stayed in the room after she left. He didn't say it out loud, but he heard it anyway, ever. The call from Don Aurelio Castellano came on a Friday, not to Damien's office, to a number associated with a restaurant in the meatpacking district that Damien used for certain informal contacts, the kind of number that, by long tradition, was answered personally or not at all. Damien answered it personally. "I wanted to reach out directly," Aurelio said. His voice was the voice of a man who had been having difficult conversations for 40 years and had long ago made peace with the difficulty. "Out of respect for our history." "I appreciate that," Damien said. He kept his voice even. There are some of us with concerns about the Northern restructuring, the timeline specifically, some of the agreements that were in the process of being finalized. There are questions about the standing of certain guarantors. Damien understood exactly what Aurelio was saying and what he was not saying. Certain guarantors meant Vivienne. The agreements that were stalling were agreements she had been the informal backbone of. Those agreements stand, Damien said. The Vescari Syndicate's commitments don't change because of personal circumstances. A brief pause. Of course, we have great confidence in the Syndicate's commitments. Another pause, slightly longer. It's the particular architecture of some of these arrangements that concerns us. Some of them were built on relationships that are personal in nature, difficult to transfer. I'll have Grasso reach out and go through each one individually. Grasso is a good man. Aurelio's tone was precisely calibrated, not dismissive, but not enthusiastic. We will, of course, welcome that conversation. He paused one final time. Give my regards to Mrs. Vescari. The line went quiet. Damien set the phone down on the desk. Give my regards to Mrs. Vescari. Not former, not your ex-wife. Mrs. Vescari. Present tense, as though the last 3 weeks had not occurred or had occurred and were being, by men with long memories and longer patience, quietly declined as a permanent reality. He picked up the phone again and called Grasso. I need a full accounting, he said when Grasso answered. Every agreement, every arrangement, every informal understanding that Vivienne touched in the last 5 years. Every family contact, every political connection, every corridor capo who dealt with her directly. He paused. I need to know exactly what she built and how it's connected. There was a silence on Grasso's end that lasted slightly too long. That's going to take some time, Grasso said. How much time? To do it properly? A few weeks. You have 10 days. Another silence. Damien, with respect, some of what she built specifically so it wouldn't be visible from inside our operational structure. That was the design. Damien hadn't considered this, or rather, he had known it in the abstract, that Vivienne operated in spaces that ran parallel to the official syndicate structure, but he had never fully mapped out what that meant at scale. He had trusted the results and not examined the machinery. 10 days, he repeated. Start with Baltimore and work outward. He ended the call. He sat in the office for a long time after that. Outside, the city continued its indifferent business 43 floors below. A helicopter crossed the middle distance. Someone on the street below, too small to distinguish any feature, was arguing with someone else. Normal Friday afternoon, everything ordinary. His phone buzzed. A message from Celine. Renaud wants dinner with the 3 of us Saturday. Is that useful? He looked at the message for a moment. He thought about Aurelio Castellano saying, Give my regards to Mrs. Vescari in a tone of voice that had contained, underneath its courtesy, the unmistakable quality of a door being held carefully open. He typed back, Saturday is fine. Yatdashan. The dinner was at a restaurant in the West 50s that Renaud had selected, which meant it was expensive, beautiful, and designed to make whoever was paying the bill feel powerful. Renaud operated this way. He curated environments that made his clients feel like the most important people in the room, which kept them from noticing how much information he was extracting in the course of a pleasant evening. Damien had always known this about Renaud. He'd decided years ago that knowing it was sufficient protection. He wasn't so sure about that tonight. Renaud was 64, French-Moroccan, with the kind of silver hair that looked like it had been engineered to convey authority. He dressed well, in the specific way of European men who had been wearing good clothes for so long that the clothes had stopped trying. He stood when Damien and Celine arrived, kissed Celine on both cheeks, shook Damien's hand with both of his. You look tired, he told Damien, with the frank affection of someone who considered bluntness a form of intimacy. I've had a demanding few weeks, Damien said. I've heard. Renaud settled back into his chair and signaled for wine, with a gesture that suggested he'd already selected it. The industry is talking. The industry is always talking. Yes, but the particular conversation has a particular texture right now. He looked at Damien directly. There's concern, not hostility. I want to be clear about that. Concern. There's a difference. About what specifically? Renaud glanced briefly at Celine, not unkindly, but with the precision of a man managing multiple relationships simultaneously, and then back at Damien. About continuity. About whether the infrastructure that's been holding certain arrangements together is intact. The infrastructure is intact, Damien said. The formal infrastructure, yes, I have no doubt. Renaud tilted his wine glass slightly. But there are arrangements, you know this better than I do, that live in informal spaces, in the kind of trust that takes years to build and is held by specific people, not by organizations. Vivian is no longer in an operational role, Damien said. The words sat on the table between the three of them. Renaud looked at him steadily. That is what concerns them, he said simply. Celine was quiet beside Damien, very specifically, carefully quiet. The way she went quiet when a conversation was delivering information she needed, and she didn't want to interfere with the delivery. What would it take, Damien said, his voice dropping slightly, to reassure them? Renaud turned his wine glass once. Honestly? Honestly. Time, Renaud said, and the right person in the right position. He looked at Damien without flinching. You know what I'm going to say. Say it anyway. The families trust what they've seen earn that trust. They've seen one thing earn it over 20 years in your orbit. He set his glass down. She's not gone, Damien. She's available. The question is whether you're going to make this harder than it needs to be. Damien didn't answer. Celine's hand moved slightly on the table, not reaching for him, just shifting, and the movement was so small that Renaud probably didn't notice it. But Damien noticed it, and what he noticed was that it was not a gesture of comfort. It was a gesture of someone recalculating. The dinner continued for another hour and a half. The food was excellent. The conversation moved to other subjects. A development in the Frankfurt corridor, a legal situation in Monaco that had resolved itself quietly, the usual movement of money and risk across the geography of things that didn't happen officially. Renaud was, as always, impeccable company. In the car on the way back, Celine was quiet. Damien looked out the window. The city at night, rain-slicked, the lights multiplied in the wet pavement. You should have told me, she said finally. He looked at her. Told you what? How much of it was her? She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the city moving past her window, her face reflected against the glass. How much of what you have, what we have, is actually hers? He didn't answer. I'm not asking to be difficult, she said. Her voice was level, but something underneath it was working hard at staying level. I'm asking because I've been walking into rooms for 3 weeks wearing that necklace, and I can feel... She stopped, started again. I can feel the way people look at it, the way they look at me. A pause. It's not what you told me it would be. Give it time, he said. How much time? She turned to look at him. Her eyes were dry. Celine was not a woman who cried in cars, or possibly anywhere, but there was something raw in her expression that he didn't often see. Renaud just told you to go back to her, in the nicest possible way, using the most expensive wine on the menu to soften it. He told you that everything you built only works with her in it. That's not what he said. That is exactly what he said. The car moved through an intersection. The light was green. Neither of them spoke for 2 blocks. I'm not going back to her, Damien said. Celine turned back to her window. I know, she said. But the way she said it, flat, certain, stripped of any particular feeling, told him that she was not reassured and that she had drawn some conclusion of her own in the silence of the last 2 blocks, and that whatever that conclusion was, she was keeping it somewhere he couldn't see it. He looked at the back of her head, at the necklace visible above the collar of her coat. The car turned north toward home and carried them both through the rain in silence, and Damien Vescari, who had ruled through fear for 30 years and had never once questioned whether fear was enough, sat in the dark of the back seat and felt, for the first time in longer than he could precisely locate, genuinely uncertain about what happened next. The certainty didn't come back. Not that night, and not in the 10 days that followed. 10 days during which Grasso's accounting revealed, piece by piece, the full dimensions of what Vivian had built, and each new page of the report landed on Damien's desk like a specific weight, and the weights accumulated, and by the time Grasso presented the final summary, Damien sat across from him in silence for a long moment, and then said quietly, the only thing that accurately captured what the document in front of him meant. She built a second syndicate. Grasso said nothing. Inside mine, Damien said. She built a parallel structure, every agreement, every political contact, every corridor arrangement that actually held. It runs through her, not through me. He looked at Grasso. For how long? Grasso looked uncomfortable in a way that was not characteristic of him. The earliest traces I can find go back about 14 years. 14 years. Damien picked up the report and set it back down without reading more of it. Outside the window, the city was having an ordinary morning, indifferent as always to whatever was collapsing inside the buildings it surrounded. Where is she? He asked. She took a flight to Geneva 4 days ago, Grasso said. She's been there since. Doing what? Grasso hesitated. Meeting with the Ferretti family representatives, and with 2 members of the Eastern European corridor, and with a pause. With the man who handles the Castellano family's international banking, the Ferretti family, the Eastern European corridor, the Castellano banking operation, 3 of the 5 major family groups, in 4 days, in Geneva. Damien stood up from his desk and walked to the window and stood there with his back to the room. Below, 43 floors down, the city moved through its morning. He had stripped the necklace from her throat in front of every person who mattered in the world they lived in. He had done it publicly, deliberately, with the full intention of making an irreversible statement. He had succeeded. He had simply made the wrong statement. Get me a flight to Geneva, he said. When? He turned from the window. His face was still controlled, the particular flatness of a man who had spent decades making sure his face delivered only the information he chose to deliver. But his eyes had the look of someone who had done the calculation 3 times and gotten the same answer each time and did not like the answer. Tonight, he said. The flight to Geneva took 8 hours and 40 minutes, and Damien spent most of it awake. Not planning. He was past the phase where planning felt like the right response. He sat in the leather seat of the private cabin with a glass of water he didn't drink and the Grasso report open on the seat beside him, and he read it again. Not for new information, he'd already extracted the information, but for texture. For the thing underneath the facts that the facts were trying to tell him. What they told him, page after page, was this. Vivian had been more careful than he'd known, more deliberate than he'd credited, and more patient than he would have been capable of being in her position. Every connection she'd built had been built slowly. Every relationship had been cultivated over years, with the specific unhurried attention of someone who understood that trust was not an event, but an accumulation. She had never rushed anything. She had never overplayed her hand. She had simply shown up, consistently, for 22 years, and done the work, and let the work speak. And the work had spoken so quietly that Damien had spent 2 decades hearing it as silence. He closed the report somewhere over the Atlantic and didn't open it again. He landed in Geneva at 6 in the morning local time. Gray light, cold air that tasted like altitude and money. His driver met him at the private terminal and didn't ask questions. Good drivers never did. He knew where she was staying. Grasso had gotten that without difficulty. Vivian had never been a woman who hid her location from people she wasn't afraid of, and she wasn't afraid of Damien. That, in itself, was information he was still processing. The hotel was a 19th century building near the lake, the kind of place that had been expensive for so long that it had stopped needing to advertise. He walked through the lobby at 6:40 in the morning in yesterday's clothes, and nobody looked at him twice. Money made that possible. He'd always understood that. He was less certain this morning about what else money made possible and what it definitively did not. He called her from the lobby. She answered on the 4th ring. Her voice was completely awake. She'd always been a light sleeper, another thing he'd stopped noticing years ago. "You're in Geneva," she said. Not a question. Lobby. A pause. Not surprise. More like a woman deciding how to arrange furniture before guests arrived. "Give me 15 minutes. She gave him 12. She came off the elevator in a charcoal wool blazer and dark trousers, her hair pulled back, no jewelry, no necklace around her throat. He'd been aware of looking for it before he consciously decided to look. She'd been in Geneva 4 days. She'd left the necklace behind, or she'd never worn it in the first place. He didn't know which. She crossed the lobby toward him with the walk he'd known for 27 years. Not hurried, not performed, just purposeful in the specific way that meant she had somewhere to be and had decided this was it. She stopped 2 feet from him. He looked at her. She looked at him. "Breakfast," she said. "There's a room off the east corridor. They open at 6:30. It wasn't a question or an invitation. It was a logistics decision. He followed her. The breakfast room was small, high-ceilinged, with windows that looked out over a courtyard where nothing was happening yet. They were the only people there. A waiter brought coffee without being asked, which was the particular gift of very good hotels. Vivian added nothing to her coffee and drank it as it came. Damien wrapped both hands around his cup and looked at the table. "I read Grasso's report," he said. "I assumed you would." 14 years, Vivian. Approximately. She set her cup down. "I didn't plan it as a structure from the beginning. It developed organically. Problems arose. I solved them. The people whose problems I'd solved remembered it. That's how trust works. That's not what I'm asking." "Then ask what you're asking." He looked at her directly. "Did you build it as protection against me?" The question sat between them. The courtyard outside was still empty. A pigeon crossed the flagstones below, pecked at something, moved on. "No," she said. "Not initially." A pause. And it was a real pause, not a performance of consideration, but actual thought. "Later, yes. When I understood that when the direction you were moving in became clear, I made sure the architecture I'd built was self-sustaining, independent, not because I was planning to use it against you, because I needed it to exist regardless of what happened between us." "And what's happening between us now?" She looked at him with an expression he hadn't seen before. Not cold, not warm. Something more complicated and more tired than either. "I'm in Geneva having meetings," she said. "You're in Geneva chasing me. That's what's happening." Something moved in his chest. He didn't try to name it. "Renaud told me to come back," he said. "In everything but those words." "I know." "The Castellano representative used your name, present tense, like nothing had changed." "Things haven't changed," she said. "That's your discovery, not mine." He put his cup down. "What do you want, Vivian?" She looked at him. The question had come out differently than he'd intended, stripped of strategy, which was not characteristic of him, and she heard it, and he saw her hear it. "Right now," she said, "I want to finish what I came to Geneva to finish. I have a meeting in 2 hours. And after that? After that, I have another meeting." "Vivian." "Damien." Her voice was patient in the way that wasn't patience at all, but something that had passed through patience and come out the other side. "What do you want me to say? That I'll come back? Come back to what? The house, the title, the arrangement where I run the architecture and you run the flag and we both pretend that's a marriage? That's not what I'm offering." "Then what are you offering?" He didn't answer, because the honest answer was that he didn't know yet, and she could hear the not knowing in the silence, and she nodded once, not unkindly, and picked up her coffee again. "Go get some sleep," she said. "You look like you've been awake for 20 hours. 19. Go to sleep, Damien." He went. He slept 4 hours in a room on the 3rd floor and woke up to 3 messages from Grasso and 1 from Celine. He read Grasso's first. The first 2 were logistics, routine items that Grasso was flagging for awareness. The third was not routine. It was 4 sentences long, and each sentence landed with the specific weight of information that had been delivered carefully because the person delivering it understood it was going to hurt. He read it twice. Then he called Grasso. "The Ferretti meeting," he said, before Grasso could speak. "You said she met with Ferretti representatives." "Yes." "Which representatives?" A beat. "Marco Ferretti and his sister Lucia, the 2 senior members." "Not intermediaries, the principals themselves." "Yes." Damien sat on the edge of the hotel bed and looked at the wall. The wall was pale gray and had a painting on it, a landscape, mountains, utterly inoffensive. "And the Eastern European corridor, you said 2 members. Ostrovsky and the woman who runs the Krakow operation." "Zelinska." Ostrovsky and Zelinska, senior figures. Not people who took meetings with anyone below a certain level of authority. She's not building a parallel structure, Damien said slowly. The understanding was arriving in real time, assembling itself from pieces that had been in the report but that he hadn't configured correctly until now. She's already built it. What she's doing in Geneva is she's formalizing it. She's converting 20 years of informal relationships into something that can function independently. Silence from Grasso. Say something, Damien said. I think that's correct, Grasso said carefully. If she formalizes the Ferretti relationship and the Eastern Corridor simultaneously, combined with the Castellano banking connection, yes. Grasso paused. That's 3 of the 5 families with direct formal ties to her independent of the Viscari structure. Damien stood up. He walked to the window. The lake was visible from here, flat, silver gray in the midday light, Geneva arranged around it with the particular Swiss precision that looked like calm and was actually just control at a different scale. When does her second meeting end? He asked. I don't know the schedule. Find out, he paused, and find out who else is in Geneva this week. Any family representatives, any corridor principals, anyone connected to our operations within the last 5 years. That'll take a few hours. You have one. He ended the call. He stood at the window and looked at the lake and did the calculation again because he needed to be wrong, and he wasn't wrong. She wasn't fleeing. She wasn't hiding. She wasn't quietly stepping back and letting him run the syndicate without her. She was building something new. Right now, in this city, with his own networks, his own families, the relationships she'd cultivated on his behalf for 22 years, she was converting them into the foundation of something that didn't need him. He was still processing this when his phone buzzed. Celine. He answered. We have a problem, she said. No preamble. Her voice was the voice she used when she'd already decided something and was delivering the decision as a finished product. Tell me. Renaud called me this morning, not to discuss dinner arrangements. A brief pause. He's in Geneva. Damien went still. He flew in last night, Celine said. He's been here since 4 this morning. He has a meeting this afternoon. With who? Another pause. Longer. The kind of pause that existed because the person on the other end was deciding how to say something they'd been sitting with for long enough that the sitting had changed the shape of it. With Vivian, Celine said. The room was quiet. The lake outside the window was still silver gray and flat and utterly indifferent. Renaud told me to bring her back, Damien said. More to himself than to Celine. I know what Renaud told you. He sat across a dinner table and advised me to reconcile with my wife, and then he flew to Geneva the same night and took a meeting with her. Something cold was moving through him. Not surprise, he was past surprise, but the specific sensation of understanding the shape of something fully and not liking the shape. How long has he been in contact with her? I don't know. How long have you known he was in contact with her? The pause this time was different, shorter. The pause of someone who had decided, in the moment before answering, to tell the truth. 3 weeks, Celine said, since the summit. Damien turned from the window. His reflection in the glass turned with him. A man in a gray room in a foreign city who was only now understanding the dimensions of the room he was actually in. Explain that, he said. His voice was very quiet. He called me the morning after the summit. He said he'd been in contact with Vivian. He said he wanted me to understand that there were people moving to support her and that I should be aware of the landscape. A pause. I thought he was warning me. I thought it was a courtesy. Was it? Silence. Celine. I don't know anymore, she said. I thought it was a courtesy because Renaud and I have a long history, and I trusted that he... She stopped. He's been feeding her information, Damien. I think he has been from the beginning. I think the dinner was designed to give you the impression that your options were narrowing so that you'd come to Geneva and she could manage the conversation. He sat down on the bed. He did it because standing suddenly felt like it was costing more than he wanted to spend. She didn't know I was coming, he said. Are you certain? He thought about the lobby, the 15 minutes she'd asked for, the 12 she'd taken, the way she'd come off the elevator already composed, already arranged, the specific quality of someone who hadn't been rushed. He'd read it as efficiency. He'd read it as Vivian being Vivian. He thought about the question she'd asked him at breakfast. What are you offering? Not what do you want? What are you offering? The question of someone who was assessing a position, not receiving an unexpected visitor. She knew, he said. Yes, Celine said. I think so. So Renaud told her I was coming, and she... He stopped, ran the morning backward through his head, the lobby, the breakfast room, the conversation that had felt in the moment like the first honest exchange they'd had in years, the way she'd looked at him, tired, complicated, genuinely present in a way that had felt like something real. She managed me. Damien. She sat across the table from me and managed the conversation and sent me to bed. And while I was sleeping, she went to her second meeting and Renaud flew in. And right now they're in a room together and I'm... He looked at the pale gray wall, at the inoffensive mountain painting. I'm in a hotel room. Yes, Celine said. He stood up. I need you to do something, he said. What? Call Grasso. Tell him I need the name of the hotel where Renaud is staying, and I need it in the next 20 minutes. And then? And then stay in New York, he said. Don't go to any meetings. Don't speak to any family contacts. Don't do anything that gives anyone an opportunity to read your position until I'm back. A pause. How long? 24 hours. He was already moving toward the bathroom, toward the clothes he'd hung up out of hotel room habit. Celine. Yes. Was there anything else? Anything Renaud told you in the last 3 weeks that you didn't tell me? The pause was long enough to be its own answer. He told me, she said slowly, that the necklace had a history that I didn't fully understand, that there were protocols, traditions that governed what the necklace meant and how it could be transferred. Another pause. He said that certain families considered the transfer that happened at the summit to be irregular. Irregular, Damien repeated. Potentially invalid, Celine said. His word. Potentially invalid. A transfer of the Donna necklace that was potentially invalid, which meant that in the eyes of the families that held the oldest interpretation of the syndicate's traditions, Vivian might still be considered the legitimate Donna. Not symbolically, structurally, with everything that it implied about whose authority was actually recognized. Why didn't you tell me this 3 weeks ago? He said. His voice was very flat. Because I thought he was trying to frighten me, Celine said. Because I thought if I told you it would... I thought you would... She stopped. I didn't want to give you a reason to go back to her. The room was very quiet. I need to go, he said. Damien? He ended the call. He stood in the center of the hotel room for exactly 30 seconds, which was how long he allowed himself before he began moving again. 30 seconds was the maximum he'd ever permitted himself for anything that felt like the ground shifting under him. Longer than that, and it stopped being processing and started being something he didn't have a word for that he'd always avoided. He finished dressing. He called Grasso directly. Grasso had the hotel name in 11 minutes. The hotel was 8 minutes away on foot. Damien walked. The air off the lake was cold enough to be clarifying the way Vivian had once described cold air, and he noticed the thought and put it somewhere he could examine later and kept moving. He found Renaud in the lobby bar. Or rather, Renaud found him, because Renaud was already seated facing the entrance when Damien walked in, and the positioning had the quality of someone who had expected to be found and had arranged himself accordingly. Damien, Renaud said. He did not look surprised. You're not going to offer me a drink, Damien said. He sat down across from him without being invited. If you'd like. Where is she? Renaud looked at him steadily. In daylight, in a bar, without the architecture of an expensive restaurant around him, he looked older than he had at dinner. More tired. More like what he actually was. A man who had been navigating other people's dangerous situations for 40 years and had accumulated, alongside the money and the silver hair, a specific weariness that no amount of good wine had fully addressed. She's finished her meetings for the morning, Renaud said. She's upstairs. In this hotel? Yes. Damien looked at him. Tell me something true, he said. Tell me one thing in this conversation that isn't managed. Renaud was quiet for a moment. A waiter moved past. The bar was mostly empty. It was not yet noon, and Geneva bars filled later than this. The lake was visible through the windows, still flat, still gray. "She didn't know you were coming," Renaud said. "That part wasn't managed. I told her you'd taken a flight last night. I knew because I was at the same terminal and the Viscari plane is not subtle. But I told her after she'd already landed, already checked in. The conversation you had this morning was hers, not mine." Damien sat with this. "The dinner," he said. "The dinner was—" Renaud paused. "I wanted you to understand the situation clearly before it became irreversible. I wasn't trying to move you toward her. I was trying to make sure you knew what you were losing before you finished losing it. And calling Celine 3 weeks ago." Something moved across Renaud's face. Not guilt exactly. More like the expression of someone who had made a choice they'd considered carefully and still weren't certain about. Celine needed to understand what she'd walked into. She came into this without full information. That wasn't fair to her. "You were protecting her." "I was being honest with her. There's a difference." He looked at Damien directly. "She's not a bad person, Damien. She made bad calculations. So did you." The sentence landed simply, without decoration. Damien looked at the table. "The necklace," he said. "The validity question." "The 3 oldest families have a position," Renaud said. "It's not universal, but it's not fringe. They believe the transfer was not in accordance with the protocols that govern the necklace's authority. They believe it cannot be transferred unilaterally by a male head of house, that it requires consent, either from the previous holder or from a formal council vote." He paused. "Vivian did not consent. I'm the head of the syndicate." "You are," Renaud said, "and they're not disputing that. They're disputing the specific act of transfer. They're saying they're saying it's still hers." He looked at Damien without flinching. "And until that question is formally resolved, any woman wearing it who isn't Vivian is wearing it under contested legitimacy." Contested legitimacy. 2 words that, in the world they lived in, carried the specific gravity of things that started quietly and ended in rooms with locked doors and consequences that couldn't be undone. Damien looked at the window, the lake, the gray light. "We're upstairs," he said. Renaud told him. He took the elevator. 4th floor, east corridor, the room at the end. He stood in front of the door for a moment, not hesitating, just arriving, the way you arrived at something after a long walk and needed a second before you knocked. He knocked. She opened the door. She was still in the blazer and trousers from breakfast, her hair still pulled back, and she looked at him with an expression that told him she'd known he was coming. Not from management, but from knowing him for 27 years, from understanding how he moved through problems, from 22 years of watching him follow a thing to its conclusion, regardless of whether the conclusion was going to be comfortable. "Renaud told you," she said, "about the necklace, about the validity question." She stepped back from the door. He came in. The room was neat in the way her spaces always were. Not sterile, but organized. Everything with a purpose and a place. A leather notebook open on the desk, a half-finished coffee. The window showing the same lake from a different angle. "How long have you known?" he asked. "About the validity question? Since the night of the summit." She sat in the chair at the desk and looked at him. "An elder from the Calabrian branch reached me the following morning. He said the 3 oldest families had reviewed the protocols and there was a consensus position forming." "You didn't tell me." "No," she said. "Why?" She looked at him. The look had no anger in it, which was almost worse than anger would have been. "Because it wasn't information I owed you," she said. "You made a decision without consulting me. I made a decision about my own response without consulting you. Those are the same thing." "They're not the same thing." "They're not identical," she agreed, "but the principle is the same." She picked up her coffee, looked at it, set it back down. "What do you want, Damien? Not the syndicate, not the families. What do you actually want from this conversation?" He stood in the center of the room and looked at her and said the thing he hadn't been able to say at breakfast. The thing that had been sitting in his chest since the car ride back from dinner with Renaud, since reading Grasso's report somewhere over the Atlantic. "I want to know if there's anything left," he said. "Between us. Outside of the syndicate, outside of the necklace and the protocols and what the families need. I want to know if I destroyed it entirely." She was quiet for a long time. Outside the window, a boat appeared on the lake, small, moving slowly, leaving a thin white line in the gray water behind it. "You should know," she said finally, "that Celine reached out to me." He went very still. "2 days ago," Vivian said. "She sent a message through a channel I didn't know she had access to, which was itself informative." She paused. "She said she wanted to meet. She said there were things I needed to know about the situation that I might not have full visibility into." "What things?" Damien said. His voice had gone careful in the way of someone walking on ground they hadn't mapped. "I haven't met with her yet," Vivian said. "I wanted to think about it first." She looked at him. "She said there were people around you, people she'd identified in the last 3 weeks, who weren't managing the situation the way you believed they were." "What people?" "She didn't say in the message. She said it was better said in person." Vivian's eyes were steady, watching him. "She also said that some of what happened at the summit, the timing, the specific moment, the fact that the right people were positioned to witness it, was not entirely spontaneous." The room was very quiet. Damien heard what she was saying beneath what she was saying. He heard it the way you heard something that had been trying to reach you for weeks and had finally found a frequency you could receive. The summit, the timing, the positioning of witnesses, the fact that every Don, every capo, every elder worth witnessing had been in the room at the precise moment he'd unclasped the necklace from his wife's throat. He had believed in the weeks since that the gathering had simply been coincidental. The summit always brought everyone together. The timing had been his own impulse, an anger that had reached its limit on that particular night after years of reaching and pulling back. But the summit had been on Celine's recommendation this year. She had suggested the venue change, the Castelverde estate instead of the usual location. She had arranged his meeting schedule in the days beforehand. She had, he now recalled, steered 3 specific conversations in the week prior that had ended with him feeling, each time, that Vivian's position in the syndicate was a problem that needed to be addressed definitively. He thought about Celine arriving at his side at the exact right moment, the necklace already in his hand before he'd consciously decided to reach for it. Had he decided, or had the situation been constructed so that deciding felt like the only option available? "She staged it," he said. The words arrived flat, without heat. The way understanding sometimes arrived when you'd been wrong for so long that the right answer had no energy left. Vivian said nothing. She watched him. "Celine staged the summit," he said. "She designed the situation so I would make that move, in that room, in front of those witnesses. Because if the transfer was witnessed by everyone simultaneously, it would be harder to reverse. It would look like a definitive decision rather than—" He stopped. "She needed it to look irrevocable." "Why would she need that?" Vivian asked, quietly, not leading him, just asking. He looked at her, and the answer that came was not the answer of a husband or a head of the syndicate or a man assessing strategy. It was the answer of someone who had just understood, with the specific cold clarity of 27 years of reading people in dangerous rooms, that the person he'd been closest to for 4 years had been, from the beginning, building towards something that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with what stood behind him. "Because she needed me to destroy my own foundation," he said. "She needed me to cut Vivian out publicly, irrevocably, in a way that couldn't be quietly walked back. Because as long as you were in the picture, as long as you were the Donna, there was no path for her to take control of the syndicate's infrastructure." He paused. "She wasn't after the necklace. She was after what the necklace represents. She was after the families. She's been positioning herself to take over the entire operation." Vivian stood up from the chair. She walked to the window and stood there with her back to him, looking at the lake, and her shoulders were very straight, and her hands were at her sides, and she was the particular stillness of someone absorbing something they'd suspected but hadn't wanted to confirm. "She contacted me 2 days ago," Vivian said, not turning around. "She told me there were people I needed to know about. She offered me information." A pause. She's playing both sides. Yes, Damien said. She's offering me information about threats to my position in exchange for what? What does she want from me? She wants you to trust her enough to take a meeting, Damien said. And in that meeting, she'll give you enough real information to establish credibility. And then she'll steer you toward a position that benefits her. He paused. It's what she did with me. She spent months giving me real information about real problems, building credibility, until I trusted her enough that when she started steering, I didn't notice I was being steered. Vivian turned from the window. They looked at each other across the hotel room, across the neat desk and the open notebook and the half-finished coffee, and the specific quality of the silence between them was not like any silence they'd had in years. It had the texture of two people who had, independently, been walking toward the edge of the same drop and had reached it from different directions, and were now standing at the edge together looking down. She has mercenaries, Damien said. The knowledge arrived as he said it, not from new information, but from the accumulated pattern of weeks of data clicking into a configuration he hadn't assembled until this moment. She's been building operational capacity outside the syndicate. Renault's contacts in the Gulf, the rerouting through Baltimore. I assumed that was you, but Baltimore was months ago, before the summit. I know, Vivian said. You know. I've known about the external operations for 6 weeks, she said. I didn't know whose they were until 3 days ago. What happened 3 days ago? She looked at him. The Ferretti meeting. Marco told me that a woman matching Cellini's description had approached 2 of his security contractors 8 weeks ago, offering a significant contract for she paused, for a security operation, the specific parameters of which he would not discuss. But he came to you. He came to me, she confirmed, because the contractors his people recognized were formerly associated with operations that had targeted syndicate figures in the past. The room was very quiet again. The lake outside the window was flat and gray, and the boat that had been crossing it earlier was gone. She's going to move soon, Damien said. She's been building this for months, and the summit was the trigger. She needed me, and you separated. She needed the necklace contested. She needed the families uncertain. She's almost got all of it. Yes, Vivian said. We're both targets. Almost certainly. He looked at her. She looked at him. The 22 years were in the room with them. Not warmly, not easily, but present. Real. The specific weight of history between two people who had been through enough together that even the worst of what they'd done to each other couldn't fully erase the architecture underneath. I need your help, he said. 3 words that Damien Viscari had not said to another human being in longer than he could accurately recall. Vivian held his gaze for a long moment. Her expression was not forgiving. It was too early for that, and she was not a woman who moved faster toward things than she actually felt them. But it was considering, genuinely considering. I know, she said, and somewhere in a room they hadn't yet identified, in a city that might have been Geneva or New York or somewhere else entirely, Celine Moreau was waiting for responses that would tell her whether her plan was still on schedule. And for the first time in months, she was not going to get the answer she was expecting. They had 14 hours. That was Damien's calculation, made in the hotel room in Geneva, while Vivian stood at the window and he sat at the desk with her open notebook pushed to one side and his phone in his hand running through the math. Celine had reached out to Vivian 2 days ago. She hadn't received a response. A woman who had spent 4 years engineering a hostile takeover of the most powerful criminal syndicate in America was not going to wait indefinitely for a response before concluding that her timeline had been compromised. 14 hours was generous. It might be 10. We can't do this from Geneva, Vivian said. She'd turned from the window and was already moving, pulling her bag from the closet, checking her phone, the specific efficiency of someone switching from one mode of operation to another without requiring a transition period. New York, Damien said. The estate. It's the only location where we have enough structural advantage. She was moving through the room, hands steady, voice flat and practical. She'll have mapped our regular locations. The Harwick building, the house in the city, the safe locations Grasso uses. She's had 4 years of access. How much does she know? Vivian looked at him. Assume everything. He made the calls while she packed. Grasso first, A 4-minute conversation that covered the essentials. Pull the core security team, activate the estate protocols, say nothing to anyone outside the immediate circle about why. Then Petra, who answered before the second ring and said nothing when Damien identified himself except, "How long do I have to get there?" He told her 6 hours. She said she'd need 7. He said 6. She said fine. Then he called Aurelio Castellano. This call was different. He sat with the phone against his ear and looked at the wall and waited through 2 rings, and when Aurelio answered with the careful courtesy of a man who had been expecting something but wasn't certain what, Damien said, "I need an hour of your time, tonight. The estate. Bring no one except your son." A silence. "This is unusual." "Yes." "Should I be concerned?" "About me? No." A pause. "About the situation generally?" "Yes. That's what the hour is for." Another silence, longer. Then, "We'll be there." Vivian came out of the bathroom with her travel case and looked at him across the room. "Castellano? And we need Ferretti. I'll call Marco from the plane." She picked up her bag. "Damien." He looked at her. "When we land," she said, "we operate as a unit. Whatever happened in the last month, whatever happens after this is over. While we're in it together. No separate channels, no decisions that don't go through both of us." She held his eyes. "Can you do that?" It was not a small thing she was asking. He understood exactly what it cost her to ask it. The specific vulnerability of someone extending a working trust to a person who had recently demonstrated they were capable of catastrophic misjudgment. "Yes," he said. She nodded once. No warmth in it, but no reservation either. Just the acknowledgement of 2 people who had decided what they were doing and were going to do it. They left Geneva at noon. The Castel Verde estate looked different at night when it wasn't dressed for a summit. The gates were the same iron, the grounds the same 40 acres, but without the event lighting and the 100 cars and the men in tuxedos, it settled into something starker. A house that had always been a fortress first and a social venue second, and that showed its real nature when the guests went home. Grasso had the security team in place when they arrived. 8 men, the ones he trusted completely, which was a specific subset of the larger organization, vetted not by official process, but by years of individual observation. They moved through the estate with the quiet economy of people doing a job they knew well, checking rooms, establishing positions, not speaking unless necessary. Vivian walked the ground floor within 20 minutes of arriving. Not inspecting, she'd been in this building dozens of times, but mapping it against what it would need to be tonight. She noted the entry points, the corridor intersections, the rooms where sight lines were long, and the rooms where they weren't. The stained glass corridor, she told Grasso, when she came back to the main room where he and Damien were going over the team deployment. "Anyone coming from the east gate has to move through it. It's 60 feet of reduced visibility and 1 exit point. If something goes wrong, that's where it starts." Grasso looked at her, then at Damien. "She's right," Damien said. Grasso redirected 2 men to the east corridor without further discussion. Aurelio Castellano and his son arrived at 8. Marco Ferretti arrived at 8:15, alone, which was not what Damien had asked for, but Marco Ferretti operated by his own protocols, and arguing with him about it would have cost more than it was worth. Petra came through the north entrance at 8:40 with the specific expression of someone who had been driving fast and was not apologizing for it. They gathered in the main sitting room, not the ballroom, nowhere near the ballroom, and Damien stood at the center of the room and said the thing that needed saying without preamble, because preamble would cost time and trust, and he had a limited supply of both. He told them about Celine. All of it. The staged summit, the external contractor network, the Baltimore reroute, the validity question around the necklace, the approach to Vivian 2 days ago. He spoke for 11 minutes. He did not soften anything. When he reached the part about how long Celine had been operating beneath his awareness, he said it plainly, 4 years, and accepted the weight of what that admission meant in a room full of people whose survival depended on reading competence accurately. When he finished, the room was quiet. Aurelio was looking at the floor. Marco Ferretti was looking at Damien with the flat, assessing gaze of a man running a probability calculation. His son had his arms crossed and was looking at Vivian. It was Petra who spoke first. "The contractors Ferretti identified," she said. "Do we have a current location?" "No," Grasso said. "We have the identification from 8 weeks ago. Since then, they've gone quiet." "Quiet means they've been activated," Petra said. "They don't go quiet when they're idle. They go quiet when they're on a job." She looked at Damien. "She's already moved the timeline." "How soon?" Aurelio said. Not to Damien, to Vivian. Vivian had been standing slightly to the side of the room since they'd begun, not peripheral, but positioned the way she always positioned herself when she was in a room where she needed to see everything at once. She looked at Aurelio steadily. "If I had to guess," she said, "tonight." The word landed in the room and nobody moved. "She reached out to me 2 days ago," Vivian continued. "I didn't respond. She reached out to Damien in Geneva by predicting his movements. She's been tracking us both. She knows we're together. She knows we're here." A pause. "She had a plan that depended on Damien and me being on opposite sides. We're not on opposite sides. She'll know that by now. And a woman who has spent 4 years building towards something doesn't let a variable like that sit unresolved." "You're saying she'll move tonight because waiting makes it worse," Marco said. "I'm saying she has no reason to wait," Vivian said. Marco Ferretti looked at the room. Then he pulled out his phone and made a call in a language that was partly Italian and partly something more regional that Damien couldn't fully track. And after 40 seconds, he ended the call and said, "I have 6 men 20 minutes out, armed." "We have 8 on the grounds," Grasso said. 14, Petra said, "plus the 5 of us." "The 5 of you stay in this room," Damien said. "Damien," Petra began. "The 5 of you are the reason she's doing this," he said. "If she gets into the building and finds you separated, she wins regardless of what happens with the security team. You stay together, you stay in this room, and you let the people whose job this is do their job." He looked around the room. "Agreed." Nobody agreed out loud. But nobody argued, which, in this particular group, was the same thing. Damien stepped out of the room with Grasso and they stood in the corridor, and Grasso said quietly, "If she's moving tonight, she's going to come with enough force to guarantee an outcome. She's not going to send 2 men and hope." "No," Damien said. "So we're not talking about a small incursion." "No." Grasso looked at him. The corridor was lit with the same antique fixtures that had always lined it. Old brass, amber light. The kind of lighting that made everything look like something that happened in a different century. "How do you want to play it?" "We make the building hard to enter and harder to move through," Damien said. "We keep the primary targets consolidated. We don't go looking for the fight. We let it come to us and we make sure we're ready for it when it arrives." "And Celine? If she's here to manage the outcome. She won't be in the first wave." He paused. "She'll come when she thinks it's over." "Then we make it look over," Grasso said. Damien looked at him. "Yes." It took 40 minutes to reset the estate's defensive posture. Ferretti's 6 men arrived in 32, were briefed in 5, and were deployed in 3. The building went darker. Not completely. Lights that were fully extinguished would signal preparation, and preparation was information. Instead, they reduced, shifted, created the ambient quality of a gathering winding down, people settling in for the night, the specific domestic texture of an estate that was not expecting company. Inside the main sitting room, Aurelio's son had found a chessboard and set it up, which was either a coping mechanism or genuine focus. With the Castellano family, it was sometimes impossible to tell. Petra was on the phone in a low voice, relaying something to someone Damien didn't ask about. Marco Ferretti stood at the window with his arms crossed and looked at the grounds. Vivian sat at the table across from Aurelio, and they spoke quietly. Not about tonight, about something else entirely. A long-standing arrangement involving a property transfer in 3 jurisdictions that needed a solution. Damien watched her from across the room. She had the same quality she'd had in the breakfast room in Geneva, genuinely present, focused on the actual problem in front of her, not performing calm but inhabiting it. He had spent 4 years not seeing this. Not the fact of it, but the nature of it. The specific thing it was that made every room she entered subtly more organized than it had been before she arrived. He crossed to where she was sitting. Aurelio looked up, read something in the movement, and found a reason to be across the room. "You should eat something," Vivian said without looking up from the paper she was writing on. "You haven't eaten since Geneva." "Neither have you." "I had something on the plane." "Half of something." She looked up at him. The expression was not warm and was not cold and contained, somewhere in its middle register, something that might have been the edge of the thing they weren't discussing. "Damien." The lights went out. Not a gradual failure. Immediate, complete, total. The estate going from amber-lit to black in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Then the first shot came through the stained glass corridor. The sound was not what movies made it. It was a flat, hard crack that hit the walls of the estate and bounced in ways that made locating it difficult in the first second. Damien was moving before the echo finished, toward Vivian, purely instinct, and she was already moving toward the side of the room, away from the windows, the same instinct working in her. Grasso's voice came through the earpiece. "East corridor, at least 4, possibly 6. Ferretti's men are engaging. Stay in position." Damien grabbed Vivian's arm, not hard but firm, and they moved together toward the interior wall of the sitting room, the one with no windows and no direct line to any entry point. In the dark, he could feel the others doing the same. The shuffle of feet, the controlled breathing of people who had survived long enough to know that panic cost more than it bought. "Grasso," Damien said low. "Status." "East corridor holding." They breached the gate, but Ferretti's team caught them at the corridor entrance. A pause, cut through with background sounds. Movement. A voice giving a sharp order, something that was not quite another shot, but was close to one. "There's a second group. North perimeter. They're... Stand by." The earpiece crackled. "Grasso." Nothing. "Grasso." "He's dealing with something," Vivian said, beside him. Her voice was completely level. In the dark, he couldn't see her face, but he could feel her stillness. Not frozen, but coiled, her body doing the specific work of processing an environment she couldn't fully see. The sounds from the east corridor were getting closer. Marco Ferretti materialized out of the dark on Damien's left. He'd pulled a weapon from somewhere, a compact thing that he held with the matter-of-fact comfort of someone for whom this was not a new situation. "My man on the east says they're through the first position, 3 of ours down." "How many of theirs?" 5. "But there are more than 5. His voice was flat. "She sent professionals." "How many total?" "My man counted 12 before he lost visibility." 12 against 9 functioning, with 5 non-combatants consolidated in a central room. The math was not comfortable, but it was math Damien had worked with before, and the key variable was always the same. Position and preparation beat numbers if you use them correctly. "We need to split them," Damien said. "How?" "Give them 2 objectives." He turned to where Petra was, located her by the sound of her breathing. "Petra, is there anything in this building that Celine would want badly enough to divert resources toward?" A pause. "The documentation," Petra said. "The syndicate archive. If she's planning to take over the operation, she needs the formal records. The agreements, the blood oaths, the succession documentation. Without those, she can claim authority, but she can't prove it." "Where is it?" "West Wing, 2nd floor. Grasso." The earpiece crackled back to life. Grasso's breathing was audible now, faster than normal. "The archive, West Wing, 2nd floor. Make sure they know it's there." A pause. "You want them to find it?" "I want them to go for it. Split their force." "That means leaving the West Wing lightly defended." "I know." He paused. "How many men do you have on the north perimeter breach?" 2. "They're holding, but not for long. Pull one to the east corridor. Leave the West Wing route open." A silence. Then, "Done." The sounds from the east corridor had resolved into something more directional now. Boots on marble, the specific rhythm of people moving in formation. The sitting room door was 12 feet away. Damien could hear his own pulse, steady but elevated, the physical fact of adrenaline doing what it had been designed to do. Vivian put her hand on his arm. Not grabbing, just contact. Then she moved it away. She's here, Vivian said. Not yet. She's here, Vivian said again, quieter. Listen. He listened. Beneath the sounds from the east corridor, the movement, the controlled noise of men doing tactical work, there was something else. Quieter. From the direction of the main entrance, a single set of footsteps, unhurried. She came in through the front, he said. She didn't come to fight, Vivian said. She came to arrive. She sent the 12 to clear the building, and when it's clear, she walks through the front door and takes what she came for. A pause. She expects this to be over by the time she reaches the sitting room. Then we need to make sure it isn't. Yes, Vivian said. We do. He felt her move beside him in the dark, away from the wall toward the center of the room. He caught her arm. Vivian, she's coming here, Vivian said, for the 5 of us. That's what this is. The archive is a resource, not the objective. The objective is this room. He felt her turn toward him in the dark, felt her face close to his. Let me meet her. Absolutely not. Damien. Her voice was the voice of someone who had already decided. She reached out to me. She's been trying to manage me for weeks. She thinks I'm someone she can still steer. A pause. Let her think that for 30 more seconds. He held her arm. The sounds from the east corridor were louder now, closer, and over the earpiece Grasso was relaying something about the West Wing diversion working, 2 of the attackers redirecting, his man counting 6 still moving toward the main building. 6. 30 seconds, Damien said. He let go of her arm. She moved to the center of the room and he heard her breathing slow, deliberately, consciously, the specific work of someone arranging themselves the way they needed to be. In the dark, in the sudden acute clarity of a situation where every sense was doing emergency overtime, he was aware of her in the room, the way you were aware of a fixed point when everything else was moving. The sitting room door opened, not kicked, opened, the way someone opened a door when they expected the room behind it to contain what they'd arranged for it to contain. The slim rectangle of slightly less dark from the corridor fell across the floor, and Celine stepped through it and stopped. She was holding a phone with its flashlight active. The beam found Vivian first. Celine looked at her, then the beam moved, finding Aurelio's son, Marco Ferretti, Petra, the chessboard half played on the table. Not finding Damien, who was in the corner the beam hadn't reached. Vivian, Celine said. Her voice was composed. Completely composed. The voice of a woman who had walked into a room she'd built and was now checking to confirm it matched the blueprint. I think we should talk. Yes, Vivian said. The situation outside it's going to be resolved very shortly. Celine's beam moved back to Vivian's face. This doesn't have to be hostile. I've been trying to reach you for days because there are things you need to understand about what's been happening around you. I understand quite a bit, Vivian said. You understand what Damien has told you, Celine said, which is one version. She took a single step into the room. Her free hand was at her side. Damien couldn't see if she was carrying anything, and the angle was wrong to check. He's very good at reframing things when he needs to. You know that better than anyone. I do, Vivian said. The families don't trust him, Celine continued. You know this too. What's been happening for the last month, the stalled agreements, the rerouted shipments, that's not loyalty to you. That's the natural result of a structure that's been failing for years, that he's been propping up with fear, and you've been propping up with work that he never acknowledged. Her voice stayed even, reasonable, the voice of someone building a case. The question isn't whether the structure needs to change. It does. The question is who manages the change. And you're proposing yourself, Vivian said. I'm proposing a partnership, Celine said. Your relationships, your credibility with the families, my operational capacity. The necklace doesn't have to mean what one man decided it meant on one night. It can mean something new, something you define. The room was quiet. The sounds from elsewhere in the estate had diminished. Not gone, but further away, the fight having moved or been resolved in one direction or another. The beam of Celine's phone held steady on Vivian's face. Vivian looked at her for a long moment. The contractors you hired, Vivian said, The ones the Ferretti family identified. What were their specific instructions? A fractional pause. Protection, Celine said. Operational security. What were their specific instructions? Vivian said again. Identical tone, identical pace. The pause was longer this time. Security for the transition, Celine said. For the transition, Vivian repeated. Not protection, enforcement. She tilted her head slightly. You hired men to enforce a transition that the families hadn't agreed to. That's not a partnership. That's a coup. A pause. And the people in this room are not collateral to be managed around. They were the target. Something changed in Celine's posture. Subtle. A slight reordering, a shift in the weight distribution. The specific physical adjustment of someone whose cover story has been correctly named, and who is now, in real time, moving to the next position. Damien is in this room, Vivian said. Not as a question. Celine's beam moved. It found him in the corner, standing, watching, his face doing nothing in particular, and the light held on him for a moment, and in that moment, Damien watched Celine's face do the thing he recognized from 4 years of knowing her. The rapid internal recalculation, the near-invisible work of a mind that was very fast and very good, and was currently discovering that the room it had built was not the room it had arrived in. Hello, Celine, he said. She moved fast, not toward him, toward the door, because she was a strategist, not a fighter, and a strategist in a room that had closed around them moved for the exit. But Ferretti was already there, had been there for 90 seconds, positioned in the dark beyond the door frame, while everyone's attention was on the center of the room. And she ran into him at full momentum and stopped hard, and the phone went one way, and the light went with it, and in the sudden reoriented darkness, there was a sharp, brief struggle. And then Ferretti's voice saying, I have her, in a tone that had no heat in it at all. The lights came back on. Grasso appeared in the doorway 30 seconds later. His jacket was torn. His right hand had been wrapped in something improvised, a strip of his own shirt, but his face was the face of someone who had finished a job and was now reporting on it. External team neutralized, he said. 7 detained. 4 fled north perimeter. We have the estate. He looked at Celine, held by Ferretti in the doorway. His expression registered nothing. East corridor took damage. The stained glass is mostly gone. Vivian looked at Celine. Celine looked back at her. Her hair was disarranged and her composure had fractured in the way that composure did when the situation it had been built for had stopped cooperating. But her eyes were still working, still calculating, the look of someone who had not yet decided that this was over. The contractors who fled, Vivian said to Grasso. Where? North, toward the river road. They're not fleeing, she said. They're regrouping. She gave them a secondary instruction. She looked at Celine. What was the secondary instruction? Celine said nothing. There are people in this room, Vivian said quietly, whose patience you should not be testing right now. Celine's eyes moved across the room. Aurelio, whose expression had gone flat and cold in the way of old men who had lived long enough to find anger inefficient. Marco Ferretti, who was holding her with the impersonal grip of someone handling a problem, not a person. Petra, who was looking at her with something that wasn't quite contempt and wasn't quite pity and was somehow worse than either. The secondary instruction, Vivian said again. Celine looked at her, and for the first time since she'd walked through the sitting room door, something in her face shifted below the calculation. Something raw, something that had to do not with the plan, but with the woman who had just dismantled it, standing in the center of the room without a single weapon and without a single gram of performative calm. Just the real thing. The 22-year built thing that Celine had spent 4 years trying to replicate and acquire and absorb. The documents, Celine said. Her voice was very flat. They were instructed to retrieve the syndicate archive from the West Wing and bring it to a secondary location. The secondary location, Damien said. A pause. A property in Connecticut, under a name that doesn't connect to me directly. Name of the property, Grasso said. She told him. Grasso was on the phone before she finished the second word. Damien looked at Vivian. She was looking at Celine with an expression he couldn't fully read. Not triumph, because she didn't do triumph, but something measured and complete. The expression of someone who has run a very long calculation and arrived at the final line. "The archive is intact," he said quietly, for her ears. "I know," she said. "Petra moved it 2 hours ago." He looked at her. "When we landed," she said, "while you were briefing Grasso, I called ahead." A pause. "I assumed she'd go for it." He stood there for a moment with that. "You could have told me," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "I could have." She looked at him with the complicated, clear-eyed expression that had been in the hotel room in Geneva, in the breakfast room, in every honest moment they'd had in the last 48 hours. "I'm still deciding what I tell you and what I handle." The room around them was in motion. Grasso on the phone, Ferretti managing Celine, Aurelio speaking to his son in a low, rapid voice, Petra already on her own phone managing the aftermath with the specific brisk efficiency of someone who had been doing this for decades. The estate settling back into itself after violence the way old buildings always did, absorbing it, incorporating it, adding it to the long record of what these walls had witnessed. Damien looked at Vivian. She looked back at him. "The council," he said. "We need to call the full council. Every family, tomorrow. Here." "I know," she said. "They're going to want answers about the necklace, about Celine, about what happens to the syndicate now." "I know," she said again. "And they're going to look to you," he said. "Not to me, to you." She held his gaze. The necklace wasn't here. It was somewhere in the estate, wherever it had been since the summit, the whole contested weight of it sitting in a box or a drawer waiting for this moment to be resolved. He thought about getting it. He thought about how that gesture would land. He thought about what she'd said in Geneva. "I'm still deciding what I tell you and what I handle." "Tomorrow," she said. "Tonight let Grasso do his job. Let Ferretti's men run down the Connecticut property." She turned slightly toward the room. "And let these people go home." She moved away from him toward Aurelio, toward the immediate next thing that needed doing, and Damien stood where he was for a moment and watched her move through the damaged, amber-lit room, stopping at Aurelio's side, saying something that made the old man's shoulders drop 2 degrees from where tension had been holding them, crossing to Marco Ferretti and exchanging 4 words that resolved something on his face, pausing at Petra's side long enough to confirm something with a nod. The room was not the same room it had been 3 hours ago. The stained glass was broken in the east corridor. 3 of Ferretti's men were injured. 4 contractors were somewhere on the road north with a set of documents that were going to turn out to be copies. And Celine Moreau stood in the doorway with Ferretti's hand on her arm and her plan fully exposed and her 4 years of architecture dismantled, looking at the woman she'd spent all that time trying to replace. And whatever calculation was running behind her eyes now, it was running on a very different set of variables than the ones she'd walked in with. Outside, somewhere beyond the estate gates, the last of Celine's hired men were running north through the dark toward a house in Connecticut where a courier was going to arrive and open a box and find inside it exactly nothing useful. And the question of what came next for every person in this building was still open, still live, still crackling with the specific energy of things that had been pushed to the edge and not yet resolved. But the room was standing. The people in it were standing. And the woman who had built the invisible architecture that held all of it together was still in the center of it, working, because that was what she did and had always done. And the question of whether that was enough, whether it had ever been enough, whether it would be enough for what came next, was the question that tomorrow morning was going to have to answer. The night after a thing like that didn't end cleanly. It tapered. It unwound in pieces, the way damage always did when the adrenaline stopped and the body started sending in its invoices. Ferretti's injured men were treated in one of the estate's rear rooms by a doctor who asked no questions and had been on call for this family for 19 years. The detained contractors were held in the estate's lower level under 2-man guard until Grasso could arrange transport to a location where the council could decide what to do with them formally. The 4 who had fled north were intercepted before they reached the Connecticut property sets. Grasso's call had reached the right people in time, and the box they'd been sent to retrieve turned out to be, as Vivian had arranged, filled with 22 years' worth of household financial records that were useless to anyone trying to run a criminal empire. Petra had thought of that detail. She'd laughed when she told Vivian about it, briefly, a dry sound in the back of the throat that was more exhaustion than humor. Celine spent the night in a room on the second floor. Not a cell. The estate didn't have cells, but a room with a locked door and one of Ferretti's men outside it, and no phone, and no windows that opened wide enough to be useful. Grasso had suggested something more restrictive. Vivian had said no. "She's not going anywhere," Vivian said, "and we need her present and functional when the council meets. Keeping her in a box overnight doesn't serve us." Damien had looked at her when she said this. She hadn't looked back. She was already moving to the next thing, but he'd filed it the way he'd been filing things all night. The specific quality of her decision-making, the way it accounted for variables that other people in the room hadn't reached yet. He slept 3 hours on a couch in the study, fully dressed, and woke to the sound of Grasso on the phone in the corridor. Gray light coming through the curtains. Birds doing what birds did regardless of what had happened inside the buildings they flew past. He lay still for a moment before getting up. His shoulder ached where he'd hit the wall during the confusion in the sitting room when the lights went out. He hadn't noticed it in the moment, the way you didn't notice things in the moment, and now his body was presenting it as a fixed item that would need to be dealt with. He'd dealt with worse. He got up. He found coffee in the kitchen where a staff member was moving quietly around the damage assessment with the particular composure of someone who had worked in this household long enough to have seen several varieties of aftermath and treated all of them the same way, one thing at a time. Vivian was at the kitchen table. She had a cup of coffee and the leather notebook, and she was writing in it, and she didn't look up when he came in, which meant she'd heard him, but was finishing a thought. He poured coffee and sat across from her and waited. She finished writing, looked up. "The Ferretti man on the east corridor," she said. "Luca, he took a round through his left arm. He'll recover, but he's going to need 6 weeks. Ferretti knows." "I know Ferretti knows. I'm telling you because Luca has a daughter who starts school in September, and he's been working that corridor for 3 years without a problem, and when this is over, someone should make sure he's taken care of. Not officially, just taken care of." Damien looked at her. "I'll have Grasso. I'll handle it," she said. She looked back at the notebook. "The council arrives at noon. I've spoken with Aurelio. He'll facilitate the formal portion. He's the senior member present, and it's cleaner if it comes from him rather than from you or from me." "What's the agenda?" She turned the notebook so he could see it. 4 items written in her small, precise hand. The Celine situation, the necklace question, the transition of syndicate authority, the Baltimore Protocol, and what it meant for corridor oversight going forward. He read it. He looked at her. "The 3rd item," he said. "Yes." "You've already decided." She held his gaze. "I decided in Geneva," she said. "Before you arrived. I'd been thinking about it for longer than that." She picked up her coffee. "The syndicate needs a structure that doesn't depend on one person's marriage being intact. It needed that before any of this happened. The summit just made it visible. And what does that structure look like? A council model. The 5 families each hold formal standing. Decisions above a certain threshold require council agreement, not unilateral authority from the top." She paused. "It's slower, it's harder to move quickly, but it's harder to destroy with a single bad night." He thought about this. He thought about 30 years of running an organization through the specific mechanism of being the person that everyone else was slightly afraid of, and how efficient that had been, and what it had cost, and what it had finally produced. "And the head of the council," he said. She looked at him with the expression that had no softness in it and no cruelty in it, and was simply, accurately, honest. "Not you," she said. "Not right now. Not after what happened." He nodded. He'd known. He'd known in Geneva, and he'd known on the plane, and he'd known last night watching her move through the damaged estate, making it work. He'd known the way you knew things you'd been avoiding knowing, not as new information, but as a thing that had been waiting for the right moment to stop being avoidable. "And you," he said. "That's what the council decides," she said. "Not me. Not you. Them." They came at noon as agreed. The ballroom was not used. The ballroom had too much history from the summit, too much of the wrong kind of weight. They gathered instead in the formal dining room, a longer, lower-ceilinged space with a table that seated 20 and windows on the south side that let in the flat autumn light. Aurelio sat at the head. Marco Ferretti was beside him. Two other family representatives had arrived in the morning. Vasquez from the Gulf Corridor, a quiet and precise woman of 60 who flew commercial on principle, and an elderly man named Brandt from the Eastern Connection who had driven 6 hours and showed no sign of having found it inconvenient. Damien sat to the right of center. Vivian sat across from him. Celine was brought in last, by Grasso, and she sat at the far end of the table, not under physical restraint, not visibly guarded, but contained in the way a room full of people who have already decided your fate contains you without needing to touch you. She had slept, or had at least had the private hours to do what she needed to do in them. She was composed in the surface way she was always composed, but something had settled in her face that hadn't been there last night. A stillness that was different from her usual stillness, less performed, more arrived at. Aurelio spoke first. He was brief and formal and covered the facts of the previous 24 hours without editorializing. He had the gift of very old men who had witnessed enough that they'd learned to present facts as facts and let the room draw its own conclusions. It took him 8 minutes. When he finished, he looked at Celine. "You'll have the opportunity to speak," he said. "Whatever you want said, now is the time." Celine looked at the table for a moment. Then she looked up, not at Aurelio, not at Damien, at Vivienne. "You knew from the beginning," she said. "Not everything, but the shape of it." "For about 6 weeks," Vivienne said, "I had the shape, not the details." "But you waited." "Yes." "Why?" Vivienne looked at her steadily. "Because acting on a shape isn't the same as acting on facts. And because I needed the people in this room to see the facts themselves, not take my word for them." A pause. "And because I wanted to be wrong." Something moved in Celine's face, a small, involuntary thing that was there and gone quickly, but that Damien caught, and that he thought Vivienne caught, and that the room may or may not have caught, depending on who was watching what. "I've been building this for 4 years," Celine said. Her voice was flat, not confessional, not dramatic, just accurate. "I started with Damien because he was the access point. He was—" She paused. "He was easier than I expected. Not stupid, just certain. Certain people are easier than uncertain ones because you know exactly which directions they won't look." Damien sat with this without moving. "I genuinely thought," Celine said, and then she stopped. And something in the stop was different from everything else, less controlled, more like a person finding a true sentence in a pile of constructed ones. "I genuinely thought the structure was worth taking. Not destroying, taking, making it something more functional, less dependent on one man's reputation and one woman's unpaid labor." She looked at Vivian. "I wasn't wrong that it needed to change." "No," Vivian said. "You weren't. I was wrong about the method." "Yes," Vivian said. "You were." The room was quiet. Brandt, the Eastern representative, had his hands folded on the table and was looking at Celine with the patient attentiveness of someone listening to a piece of music that is not quite to his taste, but that he is giving the courtesy of hearing in full. Vasquez had not moved since sitting down. Marco Ferretti was looking at his own hands. "The contractors," Aurelio said. "The detained men. What were they told would happen to them if the operation succeeded?" Cellini looked at him. "They were told they'd be paid and released. No ongoing obligation. And if it failed—" A pause. "They knew the risks." "Did they know who the targets were? Specifically?" Another pause. Longer. "Some of them." Aurelio nodded once. He didn't pursue it further. He didn't need to. The room had the information it had come to get. The formal portion of what happened next took 2 hours. It was not a trial. It was a council determination, which was a different thing governed by different protocols that had been established long before any of the people in the room were born. Vivienne presented the documentation she'd gathered over 6 weeks. Grasso presented the operational findings. The Ferretti representative confirmed the contractor identification. Vasquez asked 4 precise questions, received 4 precise answers, and sat back. At the end of it, Aurelio called for the determination. It was unanimous. Celine Moreau was stripped of every association with the Viscari syndicate and every connected family. Her business interests within the network were dissolved. She was formally excluded from every corridor, every arrangement, every relationship that touched the council's authority, permanently, on the record, witnessed by all 5 family representatives present. She was not harmed. That was Vivienne's position, stated once at the beginning of the formal session and not repeated because it didn't need to be. The syndicate had mechanisms for permanent exclusion that did not require violence, and those mechanisms were, in Vivienne's view, both more final and more fitting. A dead person could be mourned or mythologized. A formally excluded person simply ceased to exist within the only world that mattered to them. Celine understood this. When Grasso escorted her from the room, she walked with the specific quality of someone who has been reduced to a fixed point. All the contingency burned away, only the irreducible fact of what came next remaining. At the doorway, she stopped. She didn't turn around. She spoke to the room with her back to it. "The necklace," she said. "I want you to know, I knew it wasn't mine. I knew it from the first night." A pause. "I wore it anyway." She left. The room was quiet for a moment after the door closed. Then Brandt, the Eastern representative who had driven 6 hours and said almost nothing, reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced a small velvet box and set it on the table in front of him without ceremony. He slid it toward the center. "I brought this from the Calabrian archive," he said, "the original documentation of succession, for the record." Everyone looked at the box. Damien was the one who opened it. Inside was a folded document, old, handled, the paper the particular amber of something that had been stored correctly for a very long time. He unfolded it partially, enough to see the heading, the script. He refolded it. He slid it across the table to Vivienne. She looked at it. She didn't open it. "The necklace," Aurelio said, gently, the way old men asked necessary questions. "It needs to go back on record. The validity question needs to be formally closed." Vivienne looked up from the document to the room. She looked at each person present, one at a time, unhurried. Aurelio, Marco Ferretti, Vasquez, Brandt, then Damien. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked back at the velvet box at the center of the table. "The necklace closes the validity question," she said. "The council vote establishes the authority. Those are 2 different things, and I want them separated." She looked at Aurelio. "The vote first." Aurelio looked at the room. The room looked back. He didn't need to formalize the question. It was already in the room, had been in the room since they sat down, the whole arc of the last month compressed into this particular table, this particular light, this particular silence. "Those in favor," Aurelio said. 5 hands, all of them, including Damien's, raised quietly from where he sat to the right of center, and Vivienne watching it go up with an expression that was not surprised and was not unmoved and was, in the way of things that had been a long time arriving, simply present. "Donna Suprema," Aurelio said. The formal title said plainly, without performance. Recognized by unanimous council determination, effective immediately. Vivienne put both hands flat on the table. She sat with it for a moment, the weight of it, the reality of it, the specific and complicated sensation of a thing you have worked toward for 22 years, arriving in a form that looks nothing like what you imagined it would look like when you started. In a room that smells like old wood and last night's damage, with a torn document in front of you and a man across the table who put both things there, the wound and the acknowledgement, in the same month. She picked up the velvet box. She opened it. The necklace was inside. Grasso had retrieved it from the estate safe where it had been sitting since the night Celine left the building with it, and Vivienne hadn't. The platinum chain. The dark stone. The 2 flanking diamonds. The particular weight of something that had passed through 15 pairs of hands over 130 years and was now passing through a 16th. She lifted it out. She held it for a moment. She did not put it on. She set it back in the box and closed the lid and set the box at the center of the table. "It stays here," she said. On record. As evidence of the determination, I don't need to wear it to hold the authority. She looked at Aurelio. The women who wore it before me wore it because they needed the signal visible to the room. I think the room has a sufficient understanding of the signal at this point. Aurelio looked at her for a moment. Then the old man's face did something that was not quite a smile and was more than one. The expression of someone who has lived long enough to recognize, occasionally, the exact right thing when it happens. The room does, he said. Hoshen. The gathering broke up over the following hour. Not abruptly. These were people who understood that the end of formal proceedings did not mean the end of the work, and conversations continued in corners and corridors, the quiet negotiation of what the council model would look like in practice, which families would hold which responsibilities, how the transition would be communicated to the corridors and contacts who hadn't been in this room. Vivian moved through all of it with the same quality she always moved through these things. Present, focused, not visibly tired even though she had slept approximately 4 hours in the last 2 days. She would be tired later. Later was a calculation for after the room was empty. Damien found her in the corridor outside the dining room at 3 in the afternoon, when most of the others had moved toward the west wing or the front entrance. She was standing at one of the corridor windows looking out at the estate grounds, the same grounds she'd looked at dozens of times, but different now with the afternoon light on them and the evidence of last night visible in certain places if you knew where to look. He stood beside her, not close, just in the same place. "What happens now?" he said. Not to her specifically, more to the window. "Now the work starts," she said. "The transition, the council model. It'll take 6 months to get the structure functioning properly. Probably longer." "I meant for you." She looked at him briefly and then back at the grounds. "That's what I meant too." He was quiet for a moment. "And between us." She turned from the window then and looked at him directly with the expression that had been consistent across every honest moment they'd had in the last 48 hours. Clear, undecorated, unwilling to offer him anything that wasn't true. "I don't know," she said. "I'm not going to tell you something that sounds right, but isn't." A pause. "What you did at the summit, not just to me, to the structure, to 22 years of work that held this thing together, that's not something I can decide about in a dining room after a sleepless night." "I know," he said. "You did a serious thing," she said. "And you did it because you were certain and you were wrong, and the certainty and the wrongness together they're going to take longer than a week in Geneva and a night fighting off mercenaries to account for." "I know," he said again, "but I'm also not—" She stopped, started again. "I'm not interested in punishment. I never have been. Punishment doesn't build anything." She looked at him. "You gave up the chair. You raised your hand in that room. Those are facts, and I'll hold them alongside the other facts." She paused. "What you do next with what's left? That's what I'll be watching." He nodded. He looked back out the window at the grounds. "The exile," he said. Aurelio mentioned it during the formal session, that the determination included a period of— "Not exile," she said. "Withdrawal. There's a difference. Exile means exclusion. Withdrawal means you step back from formal operations for 12 months, and the council assesses your standing at the end of it." She paused. "You can propose your own structure for that period. Where you go, what you do, the council will review it." "You argued for that," he said. "For the review rather than permanent removal." She didn't answer. "Vivian." "I argued for a process that was proportionate and had an endpoint," she said carefully. "I didn't argue for you specifically. I argued for the principle." She looked at him. "Don't make it something it isn't." "I'm not," he said. "I'm noting that the principle you argued for happens to be the one that keeps a door open." She held his gaze. "There may be a door," she said. "I don't know yet what's on the other side of it. Neither do you." A pause. 12 months is a long time. A lot will happen. The council will take shape or it won't. The corridor relationships will stabilize or they'll need more work. You'll do whatever you do with 12 months of not being in charge of anything, and at the end of it we'll both know more than we know right now. She turned back to the window. "That's all I can offer." He stood beside her and looked at the grounds and accepted this for what it was. Not a consolation, not a promise, not a door being closed. Just the truth of where things were. He'd spent 27 years with a woman who spoke in precise truths and had spent significant energy over the last 4 years finding ways around the precision. He was done finding ways around it. "I'll be in touch about the withdrawal structure," he said. "Grasso can coordinate," she said. "I'd rather coordinate with you directly." She was quiet for a moment. "All right," she said. "Directly." He pushed off from the window ledge. He straightened his jacket, still yesterday's, still carrying the texture of everything the night had deposited on it. He looked at her profile, the familiar specific lines of a face he'd stopped looking at some years back and was now, in the corridor light of a Tuesday afternoon, looking at with the attention of someone who has recently learned that attention is not a renewable resource you can defer indefinitely. "Vivian," he said. She looked at him. "I'm sorry," he said. 2 words, plain, without architecture or qualification. Not, "I'm sorry for the situation," or "I'm sorry you felt," or any of the other constructions men built around apologies to make them easier to carry. Just the thing itself. She looked at him for a long moment. Her expression was not soft and was not hard. It was the expression of someone receiving something real and treating it as real. Not dismissing it, not amplifying it, not deciding yet what to do with it. "I know," she said. He left. She stood at the window and watched the grounds for a while after the sound of his footsteps faded. The afternoon was going long and flat, the light doing what November light did. Honest and cold and without particular interest in how things looked, just illuminating what was there. Grasso found her there 20 minutes later. He stood beside her for a moment without speaking, which was one of his finer qualities. "The Connecticut property," he said finally. "Our people cleared it. Empty. She'd been using it for about 8 months. There was documentation of the contractor arrangement, financial records, some correspondence." He paused. "There was also, there was a file with your name on it and Damien's." She looked at him. "Surveillance," he said. "Movements, habits, schedules, going back 3 years." He paused. "She was thorough." "I know she was thorough," Vivian said. "What do you want done with it?" She thought about this. She thought about Celine standing at the doorway of the sitting room with her back to the room saying, "I knew it wasn't mine," with the specific honesty of someone who had been stripped of every strategic reason to be dishonest and was left with just the thing underneath. "Destroy it," she said. "The surveillance material, the personal files, keep the financial records and the contractor documentation for the council record. Destroy the rest." Grasso looked at her. "You're sure?" "It doesn't serve anything," she said. "And I don't want to spend 6 months with a file of my own movements on a shelf somewhere." She looked back out the window. "Destroy it." He nodded and left. She stood alone at the window. The grounds were quiet. The damage from last night was visible from here if you looked. A section of the east gate still stood partially open from where it had been breached, and she could see from this angle where the stained glass had been in the corridor below, the empty frame like a gap in a sentence. It would be repaired. Things like this were always repaired. The history of this estate was the history of things being damaged and repaired so many times that the repairs had become part of the original structure. She picked up her phone. She looked at it for a moment, then she called Petra. "It's done," she said when Petra answered. "I heard." Petra's voice had the particular warmth of someone who had been waiting for this call with more feeling in it than they were going to mention. "How are you?" "I'm standing at a window," Vivian said. "That's not what I asked." She looked at the grounds, the gate, the empty frame where the glass had been. "I'm tired," she said, "and there's a great deal of work to do, and I'd like to get started on it." A pause. "And I don't know yet what I feel about most of what happened in the last month, and I'm going to need more time than I currently have to find out." "That's an answer," Petra said. "It's the honest one." "The honest ones usually are." A pause. "The council model. You'll need someone to manage the Eastern coordination. Brandt is willing, but he needs support, someone who knows the corridor relationships." "I was thinking about that," Vivian said. "I was thinking about you." A silence. "Me." "You've been doing the work informally for 15 years, Vivian said. The council model makes it formal. It also makes it legitimate, and it makes it compensated, which it currently isn't. She paused. You'd have to give up the consultancy, or restructure it. I'd have to think about it, Petra said. Think about it, Vivian said. Let me know by Friday. She ended the call. She put her phone in her pocket. She stood for another moment at the window, and she let herself be there. Let the exhaustion be what it was, and let the weight be what it was, and let the complicated, uncategorized feeling that had been traveling with her since she'd set her wedding ring on a white tablecloth in front of 212 people be what it was, without trying to name it yet, or resolve it yet, or determine what it meant for any of the things that came next. The late afternoon light held the estate grounds in the specific clear way of light that didn't have anything to prove. The grass was damp, the gate stood partly open. A bird crossed the middle distance without apparent opinion about anything. Vivian exhaled. It was a long breath, the kind that had more than air in it. The kind that carried the residue of things held for a long time. And now, in this particular corridor on this particular afternoon, being allowed to go, she turned from the window. The work was waiting. The council transition, the corridor relationships, the 6 months of structural building that would be harder and slower than anything she'd done informally over 2 decades, because formal things always were. The 12 months of Damien's withdrawal and what happened or didn't happen at the end of them. The file Grasso was destroying in Connecticut and whatever it meant that she'd asked him to destroy it. The Luca with the daughter starting school in September. All of it was waiting, the way work always waited, patient, practical, indifferent to how ready you were, only interested in whether you were going to show up. She walked back toward the dining room. The velvet box was still on the table when she came in. Everyone else had gone. The room was empty and the autumn light was coming through the south windows at the angle that made the old table glow slightly, the way old wood did when the light found it right. She stood at the table and looked at the box for a moment. Then she picked it up. She opened it. She looked at the necklace. The dark stone, the platinum chain, the 2 small diamonds that caught even this flat afternoon light and made something of it. She didn't put it on. She carried the box to the window and stood there with it in her hands and looked out at the estate that was still standing, the gate that needed closing, the frame that needed glass, and the long, flat truth of the work that waited on the other side of all of it. She closed the box. She held it. And the legend of the Donna Necklace, which had been written in the gestures of 15 women across 130 years, and which had nearly been written over in a single night by a man who had confused possession with meaning, settled into its 16th chapter, not with ceremony, not with witnesses, not with anyone present to mark it, but the woman herself, and the cold, clear light of a November afternoon that illuminated everything it touched, without judgment and without mercy, and without anything other than the simple, radical fact of what was there. She stood at the window until the light changed. Then she set the box on the table, smoothed the front of her jacket with both hands, and went to work.